"Look at you," Choi In-hee said, finger pointed directly at Camille's chest, voice pitched loud enough to carry across the gathered guests. "No man will ever truly want you, dressed up in fine things or not. You're simply here because my nephew felt sorry enough to keep you." Camille stood still, jeweled navy gown suddenly feeling like a costume rather than something chosen with pride. Cream fur stole clutched tightly around her shoulders like armor that had stopped working. She opened her mouth to respond and found she had nothing steady enough to say. "Say that again," Choi Hyun-woo said quietly, appearing in the doorway behind them, his voice carrying none of the warmth Camille had grown used to and all of the coldness Seoul's underworld feared. Yen-hee's composure cracked slightly, something calculating flickering behind her eyes. "Hyun-woo, You were simply insulting my wife in my own home," Hyun-woo said, crossing the room slowly, each step deliberate. "I think it's time we discussed exactly why you believed that was something you could do without consequence." Yen-hee said nothing further that evening, retreating with a stiffness that told Camille the conversation was far from finished. But something in her aunt's parting expression, fear, calculation, something considerably more complicated than simple disapproval, stayed with Camille long after the gathering ended. "There's more to her hatred of me than my appearance or my background," Camille told Hyun-woo later that night, the two of them alone in their Austin penthouse. "I don't think this is really about me at all." Camille began paying closer attention over the following weeks, watching the careful, guarded interactions between Yan-hee and various members of Hyun-woo's extended family with new suspicion. She found her first real clue almost by accident, helping an elderly household staff member named Grace Oyalaran organize old storage boxes in the family's Austin estate, boxes filled with photographs and documents Yan-hee had apparently instructed staff to keep permanently out of general view. "You shouldn't be looking through those," Grace said carefully, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely opposed to Camille's curiosity. "Madame Yan-hee keeps them locked for a reason." "What reason?" Camille asked gently. Grace hesitated for a long moment, decades of loyalty and fear warring visibly on her face. "I've worked for this family for over 30 years. I remember things Madame Yan-hee would prefer forgotten." "Like what?" "Like the fact that Hyun-woo's mother didn't simply abandon this family in disgrace, the way everyone's always been told," Grace said quietly. "I remember her. She was kind. She loved that boy more than anything in this world. She didn't leave willingly." Camille felt something cold settle into her chest. What actually happened to her? Grace glanced toward the door, lowering her voice further. "I only know fragments. There was a scandal manufactured against her, false accusations of infidelity, I believe, though I never fully understood the details. Madame Yan-hee was very involved in how quickly and completely she disappeared from this family's life. Hyun-woo was young enough that no one ever fully explained it to him beyond, 'Your mother left.'" Camille sat with that revelation for days, piecing together a truth that reframed everything she thought she understood about her husband's carefully guarded emotional distance from his own extended family, his particular protectiveness toward her whenever Yan-hee's cruelty surfaced. She reached out carefully to a private investigator, a woman named Denise Alvarez, recommended by a friend outside Hyun-woo's world entirely, someone with no connection to the Choi family's considerable influence. "If your husband's mother was pushed out through a manufactured scandal decades ago, there's likely still a paper trail, however carefully buried. Divorce or separation records, financial settlements, anything that might have been used to make her disappearance appear voluntary rather than forced." Camille's investigation, conducted carefully over the following weeks, uncovered fragments of exactly what Grace had described: a hastily settled divorce sealed under conditions unusual enough to suggest considerable pressure, and a payment made from Yan He's personal accounts to Hyun Woo's mother around the same period, structured to look like an inheritance disbursement rather than what it likely actually was, a payoff for permanent silence. "Your husband's mother may still be alive," Denise told her, sliding a final piece of documentation across the table, and current address found through careful, patient tracing. Camille just discovered that Hyun Woo's mother might still be alive and that his own aunt orchestrated her disappearance decades ago. If this twist has you hooked already, stay with me through this story. It's about to get considerably more emotional. Camille sat with the address for 3 days before deciding what to do with it, understanding the enormity of what she was about to potentially unravel, not simply a family secret, but the foundation of everything Hanwoo believed about his own childhood. She decided, finally, that he deserved to know the truth before she took any further action, understanding that a discovery this significant belonged to him first, regardless of how carefully she'd need to deliver it. "I need to show you something," she told him one evening, sliding Denise's findings across their kitchen table, "and I need you to sit down before you look at it." Hanwoo reviewed the documentation slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to something considerably more devastating as the pieces assembled themselves in front of him. "My mother didn't leave us. She was forced out." "It appears that way," Camille said gently. "Grace remembers a manufactured scandal. Denise found a payment from your aunt's accounts around the same time, structured to look like something else entirely. And there's an address, Hanwoo, a current one. If it's accurate, your mother may still be alive, living quietly, not far from here." Hanwoo sat frozen for a long moment, 30 years of carefully accepted grief suddenly reframed by the possibility that the loss he'd mourned his entire adult life might not have been a loss, but a theft. "Why would my aunt do this?" he said finally, though something in his voice suggested he already understood at least part of the answer. "I think your father was often absent, even before his death," Camille said carefully, piecing together everything Grace and Denise's research had suggested. "I think your aunt saw an opportunity to become the dominant influence in your life, in this family, once your mother was removed from the equation. And I think over the years, she may have hoped to eventually position her own son as heir instead of you, using her closeness to you as leverage she'd carefully built since childhood." Hanwoo absorbed this in silence, the full architecture of decades of manipulation settling over him. "I need to see this address, tonight if possible." "I'll go with you. Whatever you find there, you shouldn't face it alone." They arrived at a modest home outside Austin an hour later, Hanwoo standing frozen at the front door for nearly a full minute before finally knocking, 30 years of assumed abandonment colliding with the terrifying possibility of an entirely different truth waiting on the other side. The woman who answered the door was older than Hanwoo remembered, though the moment she saw his face, recognition arrived immediately, completely, tears gathering immediately in her eyes. "You, Hanwoo," she said, voice breaking on his name. "My God, look at you." Hanwoo just found the mother he believed had abandoned him 30 years ago, and his aunt is about to face consequences she never anticipated. If you want to see this entire reunion and reckoning unfold, please subscribe. The rest of this story is coming, and it's worth every second. Hyunwoo's mother, who introduced herself now as Grace Choi, having quietly reclaimed a version of her own name years after fleeing under an assumed identity, sat across from her son at her small kitchen table, decades of separation compressed into a single overwhelming evening. "I never stopped trying to find a way back to you," she said, hands trembling around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Your aunt made it very clear what would happen if I ever attempted contact. She threatened to tell you I'd abandoned you willingly, to poison every memory you had of me if I ever tried to reach out. I believed for years that staying away was the only way to protect whatever love you still carried for me. Your aunt told me you left because you didn't want the responsibility of raising me, Hyunwoo said, voice raw. She told me you found the family's world too demanding, too dangerous, and chose to disappear rather than stay. None of that was true, her mother said, tears falling freely now. Yeon-hee manufactured evidence of an affair I never had, threatened to have false testimony presented that would have destroyed any legal standing I had to fight for custody, and offered me money to disappear quietly rather than fight a battle I understood. Even then, I had no real chance of winning against her resources. Camille watched the reunion unfold with a complicated mixture of relief and fury. Relief that Hyunwoo finally had answers, fury at exactly how thoroughly Yeon-hee had stolen 30 years from both of them. Why didn't you ever try to reach out once I was an adult, once I had my own resources, my own authority? Surely you understood I could have protected you by then. I was afraid, Hyunwoo admitted. Afraid you'd been raised to believe the worst of me so thoroughly that reaching out would only bring more pain than silence. I told myself I was protecting you by staying away. I understand now that was its own kind of failure. The three of them talked well into the night, decades of assumed history slowly, painfully rebuilding itself into something considerably more accurate. By the time Hyunwoo and Camille finally left, exchanging promises to return soon, something in Hyunwoo's posture had shifted entirely. Not simply anger at his aunt, but a grief he'd apparently been carrying his whole life without understanding its true shape. I need to confront her, Hyunwoo said. Not quietly, not in private, the way she's operated for 30 years, in front of the entire family, the way she humiliated you in front of everyone at our anniversary gathering. Are you certain? This will fracture the family considerably more than a private conversation would. This family has been fractured for 30 years, Hyunwoo said. I simply didn't understand the shape of the fracture until tonight. The confrontation took place a week later at a formal family gathering Hyunwoo deliberately arranged to include every relative who deferred to Yeon-hee's authority over the years, including her own son, Daniel, the cousin Camille now understood had been quietly positioned as an alternative heir for decades. 30 years ago, Hyunwoo began, once the gathering had settled. My aunt told this family that my mother abandoned us willingly. I've recently learned that was a lie, constructed carefully and maintained deliberately to remove a woman my aunt views as a threat to her own influence over this family. Yeon-hee's composure cracked immediately, decades of careful control collapsing in front of witnesses she'd never expected to face this reckoning alongside. Hyunwoo, whatever you believe you've learned, I've spoken with her directly, Hyunwoo said, cutting through his aunt's protest with a coldness Camille had rarely seen from him. I've seen documentation of a payment from your personal accounts structured to disguise a payoff as an inheritance. I understand now exactly what you did to remove my mother from my life and exactly why you did it. The room went utterly silent, relatives who'd deferred to Yeon-hee's authority for decades now studying her with newly sharpened suspicion. Everything I did, Yeon-hee said, her voice finally cracking, I did to protect this family's stability. Your mother was unpredictable, unsuited to this world. My mother was unsuited to your ambitions, Hyun-woo said. You wanted control over this family's future, and a mother who loved me enough to challenge your influence stood directly in your way, so you destroyed her instead. Daniel, Yan-hee's son, sat frozen throughout the confrontation, understanding slowly that his own position in the family had been built on a foundation of manipulation he'd apparently never fully understood. "Mother, is this true?" Yan-hee said nothing, her silence answering the question more completely than any denial could have. "You've spent 3 years treating my wife with cruelty she never deserved, because a woman who loves without calculation, without strategic advantage, has always represented exactly the kind of threat you eliminated once before. I understand now that Camille's kindness, her patience, her refusal to play the games this family has rewarded for decades, that's precisely what frightens you most. You're no longer welcome in this family's inner circle," Hyun-woo said finally, turning back to his aunt. "You'll retain whatever financial provisions were established years ago, but your influence over this family's decisions ends today, permanently." 6 months after that devastating family confrontation, the Choi family estate hosted a celebration considerably different from the anniversary gathering where everything had first unraveled. A quiet dinner welcoming Grace Choi back into her son's life fully, publicly, without the shadow of 30 years of manufactured absence hanging over the reunion any longer. Camille sat beside Hyun-woo, watching her mother laugh genuinely for what felt like the first time since their initial reunion, the careful, guarded distance of early visits slowly giving way to something warmer, more settled. "You gave me my mother back," Hyun-woo told Camille quietly, watching Grace across the table. "I don't know how to properly thank you for that." "You don't need to thank me. I just followed the truth where it led. You're the one who chose to face it head on instead of protecting comfortable lies." Yun-hee, stripped of her former influence, had retreated entirely from the family's gatherings, her son Daniel choosing in the months since the confrontation to build a genuine relationship with Hyun-woo rather than remain loyal to a mother whose manipulation had shaped his entire understanding of his place in the family. "I used to believe I deserved my position here more than you did," Daniel admitted during a quiet conversation weeks after the initial confrontation. "I understand now that belief was built on my mother's manipulation, not on anything real about either of us." Camille, once dismissed and humiliated by the same family now gathered warmly around her, had become, over 6 months, something considerably more respected than the outsider Yun-hee had once insisted she'd always be. Not through status or appearances, exactly as the family had once valued, but through the same patient, unwavering kindness that had led her to uncover a truth 30 years buried. "No man will ever want you," Young-hee had told her once, cruel and certain in front of an entire gathering. Camille thought about those words sometimes, not with lingering pain, but with a quiet, settled understanding of exactly how wrong they'd been. "I love you," Hyun-woo told her that evening, watching his mother across the table, watching the family slowly healing around them. "Not the family that once made me feel unwelcome, the man who chose truth over comfortable lies and chose me consistently, even when choosing me meant challenging everyone who told him he shouldn't." Outside, the Austin evening settled gold and warm over the estate, a family finally rebuilding itself on honesty instead of the careful manipulation that had shaped it for 30 years. And a woman once told she'd never be wanted, now sitting unmistakably at the very center of everything that mattered. And that's the story. Thank you so much for staying with me through all of it. It genuinely means a lot that you watched this all the way to the end. If Camille's journey had you feeling something, that's exactly what I hope for with these stories. Please subscribe if you haven't yet, hit like, and tell me in the comments which part hit you hardest. I've got so many more stories like this coming, and I'd love to have you here for every one of them. See you soon.